I'm your host, Levi Brackman. Welcome back to Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. This week, I have a really interesting conversation with Dan Rickman to share with you. I've known Dan for about 20 years. We actually both overlapped and studying together at the University of London. He originally went to Hasmonean High School in London. This is actually the third alumni of Hasmonean London that we've had on Truths, actually the third in a row. He then went on to study mathematics at Oxford, and when I met him 20 years ago, he was going back to school to study Jewish studies in university. He's also written for The Guardian, for the Jewish Chronicle, and for the Huffington Post, as well as for Ynet News. Dan is an Orthodox Jew who comes from a humanistic perspective. He's a self-proclaimed left-wing politically, and he is also someone who has not shied away from taking a stand on his beliefs, even when it's controversial. And you will hear in the podcast that he became famous in a sense because he opposed the teaching of a particular religious text in his synagogue, and that created a tremendous amount of controversy at the time. We discuss all of that in the podcast. This is, I think, a little bit different than what we had before. Dan is a man of deep intellect as well as knowledge. He's a gentleman scholar rather than an academic, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this podcast. I started off asking Dan to describe himself in his own terms. Enjoy the conversation.
I grew up in North London, and my mother was traditional. My father was not brought up with any Jewish knowledge. He came from a family of communists who didn't want to have any Jewish knowledge. But my mum was traditional. We're very aware of our Jewish identity. And my mum wanted me to have some proper Jewish education. So got sent to Jewish school, went to Hasmonean High School, is now in North London. For those people who don't know it, it's a very Orthodox Jewish school. It roughly was a Torah im Derech Eretz influenced and set up by Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, a very great man.
You're the third guest I've had on the podcast who went to Hasmo. So we had Daniel Reinhold, who went to AJ Kimchi.
Oh, yeah.
Who went to Hasmo, and now you. So you're the third guest. So we seem to be on a roll here and it's third in a row, actually.
It's quite astonishing. I did not enjoy Hasmonean, but I did emerge from it much firmer than when I entered the school, and it did influence me. And it was quite a Haredi way. And it was also, the influences in the school were quite profound. Obviously stay with me to this day, though I tried to move on. And it was also, there was a big battle in the school about Zionism, anti-Zionism. Hatikva in my day was banned. That was quite funny because they said we should be free people here, so Am Chofshi. You see, I'm still Ashkenazi in pronunciation, so we can't be an Am Chofshi. We have to be. I think nowadays an Am Chofshi is people on holiday all the time or something. I don't know, but anyway, so bad Ivrit joke. But anyway, so
they were saying that it was Am Chofshi means a free nation, and sure. the Haredi view of it was that meant free of any obligations to the Torah mitzvot, which I don't know. I don't think that's what it meant. That was their reading into it. Free nation means self-determined, not under the influence of a non-Jewish government. That's what it really meant. I don't know why. Why did they think that's what it meant?
I think that, and this is a sort of theme in general, that I think people need to, they hadn't woken up and smelled the coffee. The Enlightenment had happened some time ago. Rabbinical authority had disappeared, but it didn't sit easy with them. Rabbis, if you don't mind me saying so, are used to authority. If you read Menachem Kellner's book, Must a Jew Believe in Anything? My takeaway from that, with great respect to Menachem Kellner, is my view, is what a Jew must really believe in is the rabbis, eminus chachomim, right? That's the main thing. Everything else, so they want the authority, right? So the whole thing stuck in there. They misinterpreted it, and also it's a sort of almost deliberate lack of a scholarly approach. They're uncomfortable with the scholarship. They want to almost get it wrong in a way. That's maybe unkind, but that was my feeling.
So I interrupted you. You described yourself in your own terms. So you grew up in London. You went to Hasmonean, and your father was, you said, wasn't brought up with much Jewish education. Right. Your mother wanted you to get more of a
Right,
Jewish education. You went to Hasmo and you came out much more religious.
right. Yeah. And my parents obviously had the usual reactions, but we got on. It was okay. And then I went to Oxford. I went straight from Hasmo into Oxford. I didn't actually go to yeshiva. My parents weren't keen for me to do that. So I studied mathematics at Oxford. Professionally, yeah, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I actually started doing a PhD in algebraic topology because I didn't know what I wanted to do. Went to Edinburgh. Met my wife, who's from Glasgow, and got married. We just had our 41st wedding anniversary. And we are, which is very nice, still talk to each other. And we have 2 kids. I settled on the United Synagogue as a place to be. I thought, where should I be? Because having been this, I was quite influenced by that sort of Haredi element of the school and I quite like the lifestyle, but ultimately I just couldn't, it didn't sit with me. It's the idea that one has to be that level of commitment to one particular derech. I just couldn't. I came to value, I think I would say that, summarizing where I've got to the moment, I'm somebody who initially rejected what I would sort of say is the wishy-washiness of what is known in the UK as the United Synagogue, which is like a sort of mainstream Orthodox. It's sociologically more like maybe conservative. Men and women sit separately, they follow halakha, but it is very much a place where, unlike a modern Orthodox, I'm sure in North America, for example, not everybody is Shomer Shabbat and stuff like that. So it's a wishy-washy place. It's got a very much people who compromise. And I didn't value the compromise when I was younger. Now I'm okay with it. I'm okay. I think having this broad church. So the way I describe myself, I'm still very traditional. I wanted to understand more about my Jewishness from not just a traditional learning, but I did, and we met through Jews College in London, and I wanted to understand more about Jewishness from an academic point of view. I actually contemplated becoming an academic Jewish studies person at one stage of my life, midlife crisis. So I did an MA in Hebrew and Jewish studies at Jews College, which was revelatory in a way.
Was that when it was part of School of African Oriental Studies, or was it?
It was, yeah. Before
so your master's is from there.
That's right.
Yeah. So there was similar time to when I was there because they closed down that program.
That's right.
The second year I wanted to do it, and therefore I went to University College London. So I went from SOAS and then to University College London where I completed my master's.
So absolutely, okay, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
You were able to complete. You were able to complete your master's at SOAS through LSJS.
I was in the last year that did that, and then I carried on doing a PhD at SOAS, actually, which I gave up in the end. I've given up 2. So another thing about me, I've given up 2 PhDs. I'm hoping, as and when I retire, nowadays I work in IT professionally, and when I retire, I hopefully, third time lucky, I might do a PhD, though I think it's probably a daft idea. But my wife is actually an academic. She's a professor at UCL in old age psychiatry. She's an expert in prevention of dementia, and a subject dear to my heart as the years go by. But anyway, I think one of the things I'd say about that upbringing, though, also is, and this has really impacted my approach to Judaism through all the learning I've done, such as it, is that I'm very committed to a sort of humanistic view of Judaism and a sort of view of Judaism which is really based on kindness, which is not a strange concept in Judaism or radical. But the thing about humanism, so even in Hasmonean, for example, people would often say, we're learning some halacha, or we're learning some aspects of Jewish law or Jewish texts, and they would say something like, non-Jews will never understand this. And I would think it's in there, even at the time, my teenagers think, why can't they understand it? What's wrong? Yeah, why is it impossible to understand it? I'm sure they can understand it. As a matter of fact, there's a non-Jewish professor, at least one, I think 2 non-Jewish professors of Talmud, one in Manchester, and I think Peter Schaffer, for example, there are certainly non-Jewish people. And of course,
we had, when we were doing modern approaches to Talmud with Jonathan Milgram, who's now at ATS, we had non-Jewish students studying Talmud with us.
Of course, absolutely. And I read in one of Mark Shapiro's books about the study of this 3D age with this teacher, because he taught rabbinics in Germany pre-war to non-Jewish students, and it's an issue. But anyway, all these areas of halacha where it becomes difficult, which distinguish, if you like, between Jews and non-Jews, I've always struggled with. I've always found difficult and really influenced my approach to it. I'm not saying that clearly there has to be something distinctive about being Jewish, but nevertheless, trying to define that space in a way which is not judgmental about non-Jewish people is very close to my heart. Also, the reason I'm on the left, I'm basically quite simplistic, really. I just find the politics on appreciate there are many counterexamples. My grandfather was a communist and an apologist for Stalin, so I'm well aware that being on the left can be unkind, but much of the left-wing politics I found kinder than the right-wing politics by and large in the UK, because the UK is quite a wishy-washy place, I say glibly. We're not up front. We try, and if we disagree with somebody, they may not even notice. There's all this stuff. So the way in which I express politics. Now, over the past few years, it's got harder to maintain that position. I think life, I'm 65, as I mentioned, a lot of things happen in your life and happen in our families' lives, which are challenging. As I say, I grew up in Hasmonean. At the time I was there, what was influential was that post-Holocaust period where we had people there whose families had been through, teachers who'd been rescued by the founder of the school. And also, I think a post-World War II trauma which affected society as well. Generally, people went through the war. It was traumatic for everyone, but especially in that context, it was a very challenging time. There was a lot of anger in the school at the time, which I found hard to deal with. That's why I didn't enjoy it, too much anger in the school. But equally, I just thought, let's try and be kinder. Let's try and find a way through this. And also, I think I was influenced by the Torah Derech Eretz tradition, if you like, because that was based on humanism. That was based on a very open view of society. Others mentioned Verdun Bruder and all that stuff. We should all be brothers. People turned against it because they said, all very well, saying this society turned to barbarism very quickly. And they're the ones 1 minute saying we should all be brothers. The next minute, they're killing Jewish people. And what's the use of all the theory about humanism when people are so willing to give up those values and start being prejudicial? And that's okay. I understand it. But still, my view is that we have to really maintain these values. The world reaction to the Nuremberg trials and the Holocaust and the understanding of what we now call the Holocaust and the understanding of these terrible events was to create the Universal Charter of Human Rights. From a Jewish point of view, I would have loved it if we'd have tried to do something like that in the Orthodox world, but it wasn't like that at all. It couldn't be further away from this, could it, Levi, right? Like, where can we have some sort of Universal Charter of Human Rights in the Orthodox? You say,
it's interesting. There's two things. As you talk, I'm recalled that I met at one point a rabbi in Israel called Yuval Sharlow. I have to have him on as a guest on the podcast, but I went to meet him a number of years ago in Israel in his yeshiva. He says, where I start off with, the groundwork, the foundation of everything is that we're creating God's image. And that I have in common with all of humanity. And that's the framework. That's where I start off as a foundation. And Judaism does start that way. The problem is then you get into sectarianism later on.
I think there's a certain amount of what I would now call Talmudic fundamentalism. And I think maybe Kirov or something, I don't know, things that people seem to take a more naive approach to the text, much more. For example, if you look at all the laws of Avodah Zarah, okay, idol worship. And there are many rules about idol worship and things about idolaters, which are said in the classic rabbinic text, which are challenging and difficult. These all became, many of these, not all, but certainly very important ones, became ameliorated by later rabbinic commentators, the Tosafists in particular, because they have to do, because it didn't work, for example, when you're living as a minority in a non-Jewish society. They didn't function. And there's that whole layer of reading and interpretation. There are many different ways of interpreting, many different ways of understanding, 49 reasons to permit, 49 reasons to forbid, and all those good things. Why not focus on the things which allow you to be more universal? Why not focus on those things? Because we see the dangers of particularism, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. And we can see dangers of Jewish, and also philosophically, how's it manageable? How can anyone sustain this idea that one human being is intrinsically, ontologically superior, better than another?
You go to the Hampstead Suburb Synagogue, am I right?
I do, yes.
And I recall, and I think you were involved with a controversy at some point around, and I think this is part of your claim to fame, maybe not.
It is. It's one of my, indeed. Okay.
There was a controversy around, they were teaching the Tanya there, which is the magnum opus, if you like, the most significant book of Chabad. And you opposed, am I right?
Yes, you are quite right.
This was a number of years ago. You
It was.
opposed the teaching of the Tanya there. Talk a little bit about what was your motivation, and then what you objected to in the Tanya, and what was your perspective on that? Because I think it's important that the audience hear from you about that.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, as you say, the Tanya is a foundational work. It is the foundational work of Chabad, Lubavitch, Hasidism, written by the Alter Rebbe, the first rabbi, first Rebbe. Yeah, and it contains in a whole load of teachings. Basically, it's always a controversial work. Always, as you well know, very controversial work, because within it he revealed esoteric truths, if you like, and that was very much
So, in other words, when it first came out, it was controversial, and there were people within his own movement, Rabbi Avram of Kalisk and others, who opposed the publication of that book.
Right,
that's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
So yeah, indeed, and others, but indeed, fine. But the point is that the main
and others, including also you had the Vilna Gaon.
Famously, the Vilna Gaon.
Yeah.
But of course, not say he wasn't a Kabbalist. That was one of my saddest moments when I realized the Vilna Gaon was also a Kabbalist, to be honest with you. But anyway, I thought he's an arch rationalist, and anyway, so there we are. But anyway, so the thing,
Moshe de Leon had a lot of influence.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. So look, so the thing is, it says there, and it's embarrassing always to discuss, but the soul of a Jew is superior in some fundamental ontological way, if you can say that of a soul, to the soul of a non-Jew. Given we're all created in the image of God. My soul is better than somebody else's soul, really? I always wondered if Maimonides, the arch rationalist, or the Aristotle, had a place in the world to come. What would you say of Aristotle? What would you say of anyone? It's just, I can't accept such a view. I'm just fundamentally not able to accept that view. Nor do I see, if I open the Herz Chumash and I look at the background of the United Synagogue, which was also influenced by things like the Torah Derech Eretz movement, this very much
point of view.
Hirschian and that whole quite scholarly point of view, it can't, that scholarly and academic influence point of view can't really sustain. It doesn't work. You can't maintain these beliefs. It's not compatible. And you open the Herz Chumash, which is standard in the United Synagogue, and you read very humanistic things. You don't read that. It's not compatible with the values of the United Synagogue. So my particular objection was teaching the Tanya in the United Synagogue. I never said don't go and study the Tanya, right? You want to go study Tanya? There's a Lubavitch synagogue just down the road. Go spend all day learning the Tanya. And also, I wouldn't have been minded if somebody given an academic course on the Tanya to explain why there are all these challenges. That would also be interesting, of course. But to teach the Tanya as a true, this is the truth, this is the way, and this is the foundational thing. First of all, it's not compatible with the United Synagogue. We do not believe these things. We are wishy-washy Brits. We're not given to such bullish statements about souls. And frankly, anyway, as I say, it's not sustainable. So we did object to it. It was a very horrible dispute, I have to say. It really was upsetting, partially because there was a lot of heat and light. A lot of personal, whenever you stand up for these things, so you get a lot of heat and light. A couple of things, and no real discussion of the substance, because in a sense, I was challenging. It becomes
personal very quickly.
Sorry?
It becomes personal very quickly.
Becomes personal very quickly was disappointing, but also, look, I wanted someone to come along and say, actually, you don't really understand the text. If you really understood the text, you'd understand that what he meant was X, Y, Z. But to be honest, really, after all these years, and I had real doubts, should we have made a fuss? Because one to be fair, the one substantive challenge, if you like, was you can find plenty of prejudicial Talmudic texts. So we're going to
and you can go to the Inyan Elohi, which is from Yehuda Levi. Yes. That's really where it came from. That concept, it's a medieval idea, which if Plato wouldn't have come up with the idea of souls.
Well, yeah, I blame Plato, but we didn't have to take him on board. But you're right, absolutely. It's in the Kuzari, it's in the Zohar, it's all throughout this sort of Kabbalistic strand of thought. So that's a valid thing. But to be honest, we don't have so many Zohar classes in the United Synagogue either, right? And no one's ever come along and wanted to teach Zohar. It'd be a valid thing to do, but they don't. But
the Kuzari is a well-accepted book, right? And it
Yeah, I know. It's really sad. I was going to say that. I look at Rambam, the Moreh Nevuchim versus the Kuzari. Which one, the guide for the perplexed versus the Ari, which one is almost bookshelves in Jewish houses?
Kuzari.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. Maimonides didn't do one out in trying to introduce monotheism into Judaism, I say glibly, but he didn't win out in any other way. And that's obviously his influence.
Well, no, he did win out in these 13 principles of faith, which
that's true. And Menachem Kellner, also Mark Shapiro and people like that, they really put boundaries on that, and it's really interesting to read what they've written about that, and I'm very sympathetic to their viewpoints. But going back to Tanya, so there was some amusing things. So the person who wanted to teach the course, he is obviously a Chabad guy, and of course he has to be nice to me because that's all part of us. He has to love his fellow Jew, but he was also incredibly annoyed. So he would, every time I saw him, he would just give me a big kiss. But so we did stand up for it. We did get it stopped. It was, and I wrote an article in the Jewish Chronicle about it. The Rabbi Mill Hill, as was till recently, Rabbi Shochet wrote an article saying why we were all completely wrong. The bottom line is, I stand by what we did. I think it was the right thing because fundamentally, it's about the values of the United Synagogue. And now, what are the values of the United Synagogue? I've just called it wishy-washy, but I think if there are anything left, then it's about trying to maintain that sort of more humanistic view and kind of view of Judaism. Not to say that the other things don't exist, not to turn a blind eye to them, but equally to understand them in that context. And that goes back to what I'm saying about the sort of declaration of, in a sense, we've got to read these texts in a way which are sympathetic to our modern, the way we have modern, whatever, our current understanding of these things. Also, people can say, well, every morning you say, thank the Lord for not making me a non-Jew. Show us any God, you show us any Obed, show us any Ishmael. So you say, thank God for not making me. And it's interesting that we're made, no time to discuss in detail. Why is it show us any? Why do you say it every day? What you expect tomorrow? You're going to wake up non-Jew? How come you say it every day? I don't know. But anyway, if I say, as and when I say Shlo Sani Goy, if I think, I'm aware of the fact that arguably it's influenced by the Greeks as well, that they would say, thank the Lord, thank the gods for making me a Greek and not a barbarian, right? And the irony of that is quite appealing. So I can say in a sort of postmodern, ironic way, I'm thinking, yeah, okay, fine, all right. So everyone has got, let's think about it, the fact that it's not like we say everything is universal. We say that we're all in the image of God, but equally we do distinguish. You look at the first look at the story of creation. It's all about distinction. It's all about creating differences. It's not that there are no differences. So we have to balance that, if you like, and think how those differences work, but try and make those differences without the value judgments. Now, the problem is, I remember years ago in our synagogue, somebody came along. I thought he gave actually one of the best speeches I've heard, best talks. He just divided the room. Right, divide the room into two, and then manage just you go that side, you go that side. And within minutes, there was a synagogue after all, but still, everyone was divided people, and suddenly created out of nothing a whole "we're better than you" type vibe. Right? And it's just the point, even in Oxford, right? I remember seeing people throw things over the fence. Balliol was better than the college next door. But these are supposedly intelligent people. It's so easy to do.
Man City against Man United, right?
I've never been a football fan because I didn't like the tribalism. You could say Judaism is best described, Jewish identity rather, is best described as tribal. And where do I go with that? Look, I think you have to keep struggling with these things. You have to acknowledge the fact that these texts are challenging. We can't change the text. And as I said, if somebody came along and taught the Tanya and said, I don't think it's right, or I think that this is questionable, and I still think this is very difficult and very challenging, that's fine. Why is the Tanya being taught in our synagogue? Because somebody's trying to get respectfully. Chabad are very good at spreading their wings, and they want to come along and spread their wings into our synagogue as well. It's not. Well,
it's. I can give you some insight into that. I think it's about if you can get someone to actually become a chassid, that's brownie points, right? That's considered to be you've done something really important, not just for yourself, but for that person's soul.
Right,
in some sense, and therefore they want to do that. That is something which they would like to achieve, in order to save you, so to speak. And so it's not an academic pursuit; it's actually a spiritual pursuit for them to impart something upon you, something they have, this chassidut, which you don't have, and now you become edified in some kind of way. learning
Fine.
it.
Okay,
So
so
it's not the academic pursuit. They're not trying to teach it.
no, I realize, but that's the whole point. That's why I didn't like it. I'm in broad principle aware of that, and I think they didn't like that aspect of it. It wasn't mean to.
I find it curious, Dan, about the United Synagogue, because I was brought up and went to the Federation.
Yeah.
And I was like probably the only like Haredi kind of kid there, because I went to the Chabad schools, but we lived everywhere, so we went to a United Synagogue style synagogue. So it was like people drove to shul, similar to the United Synagogue. It was a federation, but I never felt that the United Synagogue really had an ethos. In other words, it's really interesting. Yes, you have the Hirschian kind of approach. You have the Hertz Chumash, but there wasn't any type of, as far as I remember, there was a void there, which is why I think people like Chabad and people like Aish and others have come and become the rabbis there, and why Jews College no longer had really a rabbinic training program, because there wasn't really anything which was compelling, which was, hey, this is what we are. This is the type of Judaism we are. So I'm really interested to hear from you, and maybe we're running out of time, but what's that formulation of the United Synagogue Judaism? And even you had Jonathan Sachs, who was probably the most articulate chief rabbi and therefore head of the United Synagogue ever, was like half a Chabadnik,
I know. All right. Look, I think it really, simply, it goes back a few years before that. So you have to go back a few years, and I think it's like the remnants of that sort of more scholarly approach, right? You saw many of the rabbis in the United Synagogue, and before that, they weren't even allowed to be called rabbis; they were reverends, and chief rabbi and everything. But it was Orthodox, but very much part of the wider society, more academic, if you like. The Hertz Chumash is, ironically, was the way most young kids became aware of high biblical criticism, but it was very much a work which quoted Jewish studies, non-Jewish scholarship, and tried to give a very traditional, Orthodox, but nevertheless balanced view of that. And that was a sort of approach. And it was very much in that, it was like the shadow of that sort of the remnants.
Could it be that if Louis Jacobs wouldn't have been thrown out by Israel Brody, that the United Synagogue would have gone even further and created more of an ethos around this?
It would have been nice to see. I think that obviously, to be fair, Lord Rabbi Dr. Jakubowicz was in that tradition and able to articulate that. And his writings, I find very interesting. And actually, his critique of Zionism, I find very interesting as well. So, of course, he was a Zionist, but he was very much not. He would have been, you can read his writings, and he ended up having lots of arguments himself about Zionism, etc. So I think that, which were fascinating at the time, not well remembered. And I think they're instructive. If you want to look at the values, and I think, it would be fascinating there. I think, with great respect to the former chief rabbi, it was under his time that it was decided that, as far as I understand, the Anglo-Jewish community didn't have enough critical mass in order to create its own rabbinic leadership. But what Orthodox group exists without rabbinic leadership? Look at what Rav Soloveitchik did in the States. Look at Hildesheim Yeshiva. Look at, you need some rabbi fact. You need places to produce rabbis who will become those leaders and create that ethos. And without that, it is a vacuum. You're absolutely right. It's been handed over to the Kiruv movements, handed over to Chabad, handed over to Aish. And I'm a very uncomfortable member of the United Synagogue because of it. And also, for the influence of Zionism on that, and religious Zionism in particular, is also, to my mind, been not very constructive. Also raises issues around these things. I think the final
these are all foreign influences in your mind on a United Synagogue, which had something much more real, pure, and authentic to it. Am I right?
Pure and authentic is harder. But I don't think it's so much that. I think it's more. I think that's a slight parody of my view. I would say that it's not that there was one. It's okay. I think that United Synagogue was something which was basically compromising and very much looking at how do we. The Enlightenment did happen. I said earlier. You remember they woke up and smelled the coffee, and they knew the Enlightenment had happened. They knew they didn't have the authority. They wanted to try and create something which was comfortable but nevertheless able to develop people as well. And I think it had a value. It has a value still. It had a value. And as I travel the world and I go around, I look at places of immense value and wonderful. You mentioned Oshello and many amazing things. But I do miss the sort of Maybe it is familiarity without a doubt. And I'm not saying it's pure, authentic, unadulterated, what is, but it's more that I like the spirit of compromise and the spirit of balance and the spirit of trying to really try and deal with
realities as they are, have more an honest approach to it as it is, and try to see Judaism as fitting in with the world that exists and meet people where they are.
And within the wider society, and to reach out and to do that. And I'd like to see more of that. And for example, it's actually great. There's some very good and interesting initiatives in say Stamford Hill now, where you see Jewish-Muslim cooperation. That's great. I'd love to see United Synagogue doing much more in that regard, and I'd like to see much more reaching out, much more. Anyway, so there's all sorts of things I like to see, and people could then say, why don't you do it? I'll try. I'm making some efforts. I'm still working in my IT job, and 70 hours a day.
And you're an activist and a gentleman scholar. So very much appreciated, and very grateful for you spending time talking to me for this episode. And it's great to see you again.
Good to see you again, and a real genuine pleasure to at least articulate some thoughts, and hopefully with a degree of clarity. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.